At 3:42 a.m. Moscow time this morning, Ukrainian naval drones executed a precision strike against the Kerch Strait Bridge connecting mainland Russia to occupied Crimea, severing what military analysts have described as the most critical logistics artery sustaining Russian forces across the entire southern front. What happened next reveals something extraordinary about the strategic calculations unfolding in the Black Sea theater, something that changes the operational calculus for both Moscow and Kyiv in ways that will determine the trajectory of this conflict for months to come. The bridge is not merely damaged. The bridge is gone. And Vladimir Putin now confronts a logistics nightmare that no amount of political posturing can resolve. The Kerch Strait Bridge spans 8 miles across the body of water separating the Taman Peninsula in mainland Russia from the Kerch Peninsula in Crimea. Russia completed construction in 2018 at a cost exceeding $7 billion, making it the longest bridge in Europe and transforming it into a symbol of Moscow's annexation of Crimea 4 years earlier. The bridge consists of parallel road and rail sections, with the rail bridge carrying military equipment, ammunition, fuel, and supplies to Russian forces operating across southern Ukraine. Prior to this morning's strike, approximately 14,000 vehicles crossed the bridge daily, with military freight trains running every 6 to 8 hours, delivering the material sustaining Russian operations from Kherson to Zaporizhzhia to Donetsk. The bridge represented far more than infrastructure. The bridge represented the physical manifestation of Russian territorial claims over Crimea, the logistics backbone enabling military operations across the entire southern theater, and the symbolic validation of the 2014 annexation that Western nations never recognized as legitimate. Ukrainian strikes against the bridge in October 2022 damaged sections of the road span and temporarily disrupted rail traffic, but Russian engineers restored functionality within weeks. This morning's operation was different. This morning's operation employed a coordinated swarm of 12 maritime drones targeting structural support pylons beneath both the road and rail sections simultaneously, detonating shaped charges designed to compromise foundational integrity rather than surface infrastructure. The result was catastrophic structural failure across a 400-meter section of the bridge's central span. Satellite imagery captured by commercial providers and analyzed by defense analysts shows the road bridge's central section collapsed into the Kerch Strait, with twisted steel and concrete debris creating navigation hazards across the shipping channel. The rail bridge suffered complete structural failure across 2 adjacent spans, with twisted tracks hanging suspended above water where support pylons once stood. Russian emergency services deployed to the scene within 40 minutes of the initial explosions, but the scale of damage immediately signaled that repairs would require months rather than weeks. The head of Russia's Federal Road Agency acknowledged in a televised statement 3 hours after the strike that reconstruction will be a long-term project requiring comprehensive structural assessment and engineering solutions. That is diplomatic language for a bridge that will not function for the foreseeable future. The immediate operational impact on Russian military logistics is severe and measurable. Russian forces in Crimea and across the southern front consume approximately 17,000 tons of ammunition, fuel, and supplies daily, according to estimates from the Institute for the Study of War. Prior to the bridge's destruction, roughly 60% of that material arrived via the Kerch Bridge rail connection, with the remaining 40% split between sea transport across the Kerch Strait and overland routes through occupied territories in southern Ukraine. Those overland routes traverse areas within range of Ukrainian artillery and missile systems, making them vulnerable and unreliable. Sea transport across the Kerch Strait requires ferries that can move only a fraction of the volume that rail transport provided, and Ukrainian naval drones have demonstrated the capability to operate throughout the Sea of Azov, making ferry operations increasingly dangerous. Russia now confronts a logistics equation with no good solutions. Sustaining Russian forces at current operational tempo requires either dramatically increasing ferry capacity across the Kerch Strait while accepting significant maritime security risks, or extending overland supply routes through occupied territory that Ukrainian forces can interdict, or reducing operational intensity by conserving ammunition and fuel. None of these options maintains Russian combat effectiveness at previous levels. The bridge's destruction creates a material degradation of Russian military capability, measured not in days, but in weeks and months, as stockpiles in forward positions deplete faster than diminished supply lines can replenish them. Subscribe to Dr. Elena Harris right now and hit that notification bell, because what is unfolding in the Kerch Strait is not just a tactical victory, but a strategic transformation of the operational environment across the entire southern front. And you need to understand exactly what this means for Russian capabilities, Ukrainian momentum, and the broader trajectory of this conflict. The economic impact extends beyond purely military considerations. Crimea's civilian economy depends on the bridge for food supplies, consumer goods, construction materials, and the tourism industry that Moscow promoted as evidence of normalcy after annexation. Approximately 4 million people reside in Crimea, and the peninsula produces minimal food domestically, relying on imports from mainland Russia to sustain the population. Ferry capacity across the Kerch Strait cannot match the volume of civilian goods that previously crossed the bridge daily. Russian officials have not yet addressed how they will prevent shortages of food, medicine, and fuel for the civilian population, but economic disruption is inevitable. The bridge's destruction also affects Russia's ability to export grain and other agricultural products from occupied territories in southern Ukraine. Russian forces have systematically stolen Ukrainian grain from occupied regions, transporting it across the bridge for export through Russian Black Sea ports. That theft operation generated hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue, while creating food security crises in regions Russia claims to have liberated. The logistics for this theft now face the same disruption affecting military supplies, reducing Moscow's ability to monetize its occupation of Ukrainian territory. The political and psychological dimensions of this strike extend beyond the immediate tactical and economic impacts. Vladimir Putin personally championed the Kerch Bridge as a signature achievement of his presidency, attending the opening ceremony in 2018 and describing the project as proof of Russia's ability to overcome Western sanctions and integrate Crimea into Russian infrastructure. The bridge featured prominently in Russian propaganda as evidence of permanent annexation, with state media broadcasting images of Russian citizens driving across the span as demonstration of territorial sovereignty. That symbol is now collapsed in the Kerch Strait. The destruction undermines Putin's narrative of Russian strength and permanence in Crimea. It demonstrates Ukrainian capability to strike high-value targets that Moscow claimed were protected. It reveals the vulnerability of infrastructure that Russian officials insisted was secure. And it creates visible, undeniable evidence of Ukrainian military effectiveness that no amount of propaganda can obscure. Russian citizens can see satellite imagery of the collapsed bridge. Russian military families in Crimea can experience the shortages that will follow. Russian soldiers on the southern front will feel the ammunition rationing and reduced air support that logistics constraints will impose. This is not a narrative problem that Moscow can spin away. This is a material reality that will shape Russian decision-making and morale for months to come. The Ukrainian operational concept behind this strike reveals sophisticated military planning and strategic vision. Ukrainian forces did not attack the bridge impulsively or opportunistically. Ukrainian forces developed the capability, identified the vulnerability, calculated the timing, and executed the operation when intelligence indicated optimal conditions for maximum impact. The use of a coordinated drone swarm, rather than a single large warhead, demonstrates technical sophistication in targeting structural weak points, rather than simply inflicting surface damage. The targeting of support pylons rather than the road or rail surface itself shows engineering expertise in identifying how to cause catastrophic failure rather than temporary disruption. The timing of the operation correlates with broader Ukrainian offensive preparations across the southern front. Ukrainian forces have been conducting shaping operations for weeks, striking Russian ammunition depots, command posts, and logistics hubs in preparation for larger offensive action. The bridge's destruction fits within this operational framework, degrading Russian ability to reinforce or resupply forces precisely when Ukrainian operations will generate maximum demand on Russian logistics systems. This is not isolated tactical opportunism. This is deliberate operational sequencing designed to create cascading effects on Russian combat effectiveness. The Ukrainian strategy employs asymmetric warfare principles that exploit Russian vulnerabilities rather than confronting Russian strengths directly. Ukraine cannot match Russia's artillery ammunition stockpiles through industrial production alone. Ukraine cannot defeat Russian air power through air-to-air combat given numerical disadvantages. But Ukraine can identify critical single points of failure in Russian logistics and strike them with precision weapons that Russian air defenses struggle to intercept. The Kerch Bridge represented exactly such a vulnerability, a single infrastructure node whose destruction imposes disproportionate costs on Russian operations. Ukrainian military planning increasingly focuses on identifying and striking these high-value, low-density targets that create strategic effects from tactical operations. The drone technology employed in this strike demonstrates rapid Ukrainian innovation in naval warfare. Maritime drones operated by Ukrainian forces have evolved from improvised explosive devices mounted on remote-controlled boats to sophisticated unmanned surface vehicles with advanced navigation, coordination capabilities, and shaped explosive warheads designed for specific structural targets. The coordination of 12 drones in a simultaneous attack against multiple structural points requires technical capabilities that few militaries possess. Ukraine developed this capability indigenously, combining commercial technology with military engineering expertise to create weapon systems that change the strategic balance in the Black Sea theater. Russia's air defense systems failed to intercept the attacking drones despite significant investments in protecting the bridge after the October 2022 attack. Russian forces deployed radar systems, electronic warfare equipment, and physical barriers designed to detect and defeat maritime drones approaching the bridge. Those defenses proved ineffective against the swarm attack this morning. The failure reveals limitations in Russian ability to defend static infrastructure against distributed drone threats, a vulnerability with implications extending beyond this single bridge to other critical infrastructure nodes across occupied territories and inside Russia itself. Now here is where the strategic calculation becomes truly extraordinary. Russia must choose between three fundamentally unappealing options, each carrying significant risks and costs that will shape the trajectory of the war for months to come. Option 1. Russia dramatically increases ferry capacity across the Kerch Strait while accepting the maritime security risks that Ukrainian naval drones pose to concentrated ferry operations. This option requires procurement or reallocation of roll-on roll-off ferries capable of transporting military vehicles and supplies, establishment of secure loading and unloading facilities on both sides of the strait, and provision of naval and air defense protection for ferry convoys. The timeline for implementing this expansion runs weeks at minimum, and the security challenge is substantial. Ukrainian naval drones have already demonstrated capability to operate throughout the Sea of Azov. Concentrating ferry traffic in predictable patterns creates target-rich environments for Ukrainian drone operators. Russia would need to allocate significant air defense and naval resources to protecting ferries, diverting those assets from other critical missions. And even with maximum feasible ferry expansion, the transport capacity would remain substantially below what the bridge provided. Option 2. Russia extends primary supply routes through occupied territories in southern Ukraine, accepting the vulnerability to Ukrainian strikes and the longer transit times those routes require. This option forces Russian logistics columns through areas within range of Ukrainian HIMARS systems, artillery, and drone strikes. Ukrainian forces have systematically targeted Russian supply convoys throughout the conflict, and the extended land routes through Zaporizhzhia and Kherson oblasts would provide numerous opportunities for interdiction. Russia could attempt to improve security through increased air defense coverage and larger convoy escorts, but that increases the logistics burden rather than resolving it, requiring additional fuel, vehicles, and personnel to protect supplies moving forward. The land routes also add hundreds of kilometers to supply distances compared to rail transport across the bridge, increasing fuel consumption and transit time while reducing overall throughput. Option 3. Russia reduces operational tempo across the southern front, conserving ammunition and fuel by conducting fewer artillery strikes, limiting mechanized operations, and adopting more defensive posture until alternative logistics solutions mature. This option preserves Russian forces and manages reduced supply flows, but it surrenders initiative to Ukrainian forces at precisely the moment when Ukraine appears to be preparing offensive operations. Reducing operational tempo allows Ukrainian forces to concentrate combat power against selected positions without facing the artillery fires and airstrikes that previously punished Ukrainian advances. The defensive posture might prevent catastrophic Russian defeats, but it enables Ukrainian territorial gains that will be difficult to reverse once established. Russia will likely employ some combination of all three options, but the fundamental constraint remains. The logistics capacity available to sustain Russian forces in Crimea and across the southern front has been dramatically reduced, and no short-term solution can fully compensate for that reduction. Russian military effectiveness will degrade progressively as ammunition stockpiles and forward positions deplete and resupply rates fall below consumption rates. Artillery fire missions will decrease. Air support sorties will decline as fuel supplies tighten. Maintenance will deteriorate as spare parts become scarcer. This is not a crisis that Russian forces can overcome through tactical excellence or battlefield heroism. This is a material problem that only logistics infrastructure can solve, and that infrastructure is now collapsed in the Kerch Strait. The historical parallel to Operation Bagration in 1944 is instructive, though the circumstances differ significantly. During Bagration, Soviet forces systematically destroyed German logistics infrastructure across Belarus, collapsing German Army Group Center's supply lines and creating the conditions for catastrophic military defeat. The German forces trapped in the Bagration pocket possessed significant combat power on paper, but the destruction of their logistics tail meant they could not sustain combat operations. Divisions ran out of ammunition within days, fuel shortages immobilized mechanized units, and medical supplies proved inadequate for casualty treatment. The operational competence of individual German units became irrelevant once their ability to fight was constrained by supply shortages. The Kerch Bridge's destruction creates comparable dynamics for Russian forces in the southern theater, though the scale and time frame differ from the Bagration catastrophe. The diplomatic implications of the bridge's destruction extend beyond the immediate military situation. Russia has consistently insisted that Crimea's annexation is permanent and non-negotiable, framing any discussion of Crimean status as unacceptable interference in Russian internal affairs. The bridge served as physical and symbolic proof of that permanence, demonstrating Moscow's ability to integrate Crimea into Russian infrastructure despite Western sanctions and Ukrainian opposition. The bridge's destruction by Ukrainian forces undermines that narrative fundamentally. It demonstrates that Russia cannot protect critical infrastructure in Crimea from Ukrainian strikes. It shows that Ukrainian forces possess both the capability and the will to target Russian claims to the peninsula. And it creates tangible evidence that Russian control over Crimea is neither permanent nor secure. The destruction also affects international perceptions of the conflict's trajectory. Western governments that provide military assistance to Ukraine have carefully avoided explicitly supporting strikes on Crimea, concerned that such operations might escalate the conflict beyond manageable bounds. The Ukrainian decision to destroy the bridge, regardless of Western preferences, demonstrates Kyiv's strategic autonomy and willingness to accept calculated risks that Western partners might prefer to avoid. That autonomy complicates Western efforts to manage escalation risks, but it also demonstrates Ukrainian resolve to pursue victory rather than merely avoiding defeat. Western publics and policymakers watching the bridge collapse into the Kerch Strait receive tangible evidence that Ukrainian operations can achieve strategic effects against Russian positions previously considered secure. Subscribe right now and turn on notifications, because the next 72 hours will reveal whether Russia can implement emergency logistics measures sufficient to prevent catastrophic supply failures, and you cannot afford to miss the analysis of what these decisions mean for the entire southern front. China's response to the bridge destruction will provide critical signals about Beijing's assessment of the conflict's direction. China has maintained studied neutrality throughout the war, providing diplomatic support and economic lifelines to Russia, while avoiding direct military assistance that would trigger Western sanctions. Chinese officials have consistently called for negotiations and territorial integrity, while carefully avoiding explicit condemnation of Russian actions in Ukraine. The bridge's destruction tests that calculated ambiguity. If China interprets the event as evidence that Russia is losing its grip on occupied territories, Beijing might begin distancing itself from Moscow to avoid association with a losing cause. If China views the destruction as Western-backed escalation, requiring stronger support for Russia, Beijing might increase economic and diplomatic assistance to Moscow. Chinese statements and actions in the coming weeks will reveal which interpretation prevails in Beijing's assessment. Russia's domestic response to the bridge destruction also carries significant implications for Vladimir Putin's political position. Putin has staked his presidency on restoring Russian greatness through military power and territorial expansion. The inability to protect signature infrastructure projects from Ukrainian strikes undermines that narrative fundamentally. Russian military bloggers and nationalist commentators have already begun criticizing defense officials for failing to secure the bridge, despite repeated warnings about Ukrainian capabilities. The criticism has not yet reached Putin directly, but the frustration visible in Russian nationalist discourse suggests declining confidence in military leadership that could eventually threaten Putin's political standing if battlefield setbacks continue accumulating. The economic costs of rebuilding the bridge will strain Russian finances already stressed by Western sanctions and military expenditures. The original construction cost $3. $7 billion between 2016 and 2018 under relatively normal economic conditions. Reconstruction under wartime conditions, Western sanctions, and damaged reputation for major infrastructure projects will cost substantially more. Russian engineering firms that previously competed for such contracts now face questions about their ability to complete projects that Ukrainian forces can subsequently destroy. International insurance markets will not cover reconstruction of infrastructure in active conflict zones, forcing Russian government to bear complete financial risk. The timeline for reconstruction extends years rather than months, and the utility of rebuilding remains questionable if Ukrainian forces retain capability to strike the reconstructed span. The military implications extend beyond logistics to operational planning for both Ukrainian and Russian forces. Ukrainian commanders now possess greater freedom of action across the southern front, knowing that Russian ability to reinforce threatened sectors or exploit Ukrainian weaknesses has been significantly constrained. Ukrainian offensive operations can proceed with greater confidence that Russian responses will be limited by supply constraints rather than by combat effectiveness alone. This psychological dimension matters as much as the material logistics impact. Ukrainian soldiers advancing against Russian positions will know that enemy artillery fires are rationed, that enemy air support is constrained by fuel limitations, and that enemy reinforcements face obstacles reaching the front lines. Russian commanders face the inverse psychological burden. They must plan defensive operations knowing their artillery ammunition is limited, their air support is constrained, and their ability to conduct counterattacks is reduced by logistics limitations. Russian soldiers in forward positions will know that resupply convoys face interdiction risks, that ammunition consumption must be carefully managed, and that the logistics safety net they previously relied upon has been compromised. Morale effects of these constraints are difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Armies that doubt their logistics security fight differently than armies confident in their supply lines. The destruction creates opportunities for Ukrainian psychological operations targeting Russian forces and Russian domestic audiences. Ukrainian information operations can emphasize the bridge's collapse as evidence of Russian weakness, Ukrainian strength, and the impossibility of permanent Russian control over Crimea. Images of the destroyed bridge circulating through Russian social media undermine Kremlin narratives about the war's progress and Russian military effectiveness. Ukrainian messaging to Russian soldiers in Crimea can emphasize their isolation and vulnerability now that their primary supply line has been severed. The psychological dimension amplifies the material impact of the bridge's destruction. The implications for Crimean residents also merit consideration. Many Crimean residents supported annexation in 2014, either genuinely or under coercion, and have lived under Russian administration for nearly a decade. The bridge provided their primary connection to Russia and symbolized integration into Russian infrastructure. The bridge's destruction raises questions about Russian permanence in Crimea that many residents preferred not to confront. Food and fuel shortages resulting from logistics constraints will affect civilian populations as well as military forces. The economic disruption and psychological uncertainty may shift public attitudes in Crimea regarding Russian control, Russian protection, and ultimate political status of the peninsula.